Hello and welcome to this new video. Today I'll show you the latest news about Rivian, then I'll show you Rivian's finances, and then we'll look at the price targets, where we're likely facing a significant short-term increase. This video was requested in a comment. It was a giveaway from my last video on the Nvidia stock, which was very well received. You can of course watch it later, and now we're starting. The news came that the German automaker Volkswagen is investing $5 billion in the electric car manufacturer Rivian to improve its technology. On this day, the Rivian stock shot up by more than 50%. In one day, the stock gained about $6 billion in market capitalization. Those were the brief news. Now let's look at the data. Rivian is a US electric vehicle manufacturer that competes with Tesla, but doesn't have as large a market dominance as Tesla. They mainly produce SUVs. Back to the data. Rivian is making high losses, totaling $5.53 billion, and revenue amounts to almost $5 billion. The PS ratio is 3, and the PE ratio is minus 2.7. A very big disadvantage is that they're making high losses. If they were making less than $3 billion in losses, it would be very interesting, even for growth strategy portfolios without having a very high risk. They currently have a market value of $14 billion. And now let's look at the other data and I'll explain the risks to you. The price-to-book ratio is 1.8, which is quite okay. Now let's look at the competitors. Lucid Motors looks good. Also, the Chinese automakers XPeng, NIO, Li Auto are very strongly undervalued. And in these years, many electric car manufacturers were pulled down a lot, even if they actually delivered good numbers. You can have different opinions, but everyone knows that electric cars are the future, so it's also very important to participate early. Especially for the younger ones among us, it's very important to shape a part of the portfolio in a future-oriented way. Everyone should decide for themselves what the allocation would look like. Now, let's look at the future prospects. It's supposed to continue growing strongly, almost 20% EPS growth, 17% earnings growth. It's very important that the future prospects are positive, but when you look at the chart now, you notice something very important. The biggest problem, where most analysts would agree with me, is that Rivian still doesn't have positive cash flow. The cash flow aspect is very important for large investors. I hope that Rivian will focus on efficiency in the next quarter. Very likely, they will have positive cash flows in 3 to 4 years. Let's look at today's return on equity, which is very important. The company stands at minus 68.5%, and the average would be 18.6%. Now, let's look at the health of the company. It's very important when a company doesn't generate profit or cash flow to see if they are viable. The debt stands at 54.9% to equity ratio, so they have $4.43 billion in debt and have cash totaling $7.86 billion, which isn't bad. Now let's look at the ownership. The largest shareholder is Amazon. Rivian supplies Amazon with vehicles. It's also very advantageous for Rivian because they can also make other important contacts with such a large company. Otherwise, the large asset managers are among the top 2 shareholders. Now let's look at my short-term forecasts. Before we get to the short-term targets, you can leave a subscription for it and give a like. If you have other stocks or cryptos in mind, you can write it in the comments. Now let's look at our price forecasts. I'll now show you the most likely price target. Since the bottom formation between $8 and $9, which was essential for me, if we were to go down there, the stock would be riskier for me than today, and I would continue to observe the stock. If it does happen that my target zone is broken through, I would still come out with a profit because I entered at this first target zone with a small allocation. I advise every trader against entering a trade right now. For investors who buy stocks, they would have to decide for themselves if they can withstand 11% to even 27.59%. For me, Rivian would only come to mind to buy in the target zones. If I were to buy the stock again, I would buy it under $12 to get a low-cost average. If you haven't entered yet, I would place an order at $13.25. With such a volatile title, it could be that we might come into my target zone for only an hour. It's still very important that you don't use such a large leverage. I would also set a stop loss at $10.79 for shareholders and traders, where I've also set my stop loss. If we underline it, it would invalidate my targets, and we would very likely see new lows. For people who trade with leverage, they can very likely calculate with which leverage they enter. That should, of course, not be investment advice. At this intermediate target zone that I hit, I didn't get a trade out for myself because it was very risky. For me, it was only a very important point. There are two possibilities. I'll of course show the second one later. When we're in this target zone, we could see a very strong percentage entry. We could reach the $20 and $25 mark in a short time. Now let's look at the second possibility. The second possibility is that we will have a breakthrough for a very short-term view, which I rather hope not, because if we were to do the first possibility, Rivian would be much more bullish and we could even see old highs, at which we would need longer and it would be more complex. If we reach the $17.20 mark and would see a very impulsive entry, my next sell or short target zone would be between $18.20 and $26.34. If the target zone is reached, you can of course write in the comments and mention other stocks or cryptos. It's also likely that your stock would come up. If we were to achieve that, it would be a plus of at least 23%, if not almost 78% from today's price targets. That would be better for some and worse for others. Now let's look at the long-term view. The long-term view is that I have to assume that it was a correction phase since the IPO. So the Rivian stock came with a large overvaluation at its start. With further progression, so between 3 and 4 years, we will reach at least $95. And even if it goes well, $180, which would be a percentage entry from today's price levels of at least 530% up to 1,092%. It would be very interesting for many people. We will probably reach it in 5 years. The Rivian stock is still very risky and one should do good risk management there. If you were to invest with 1 to 2% and we were to make 1,000%, it would make up a fairly large part of your portfolio. I would bet on many in the electric car builders that it makes up between 10 and 20%. The companies you might want to invest in could be Tesla, NIO, XPeng, Lucid, and Rivian. I hope this video was informative. I also hope that I have shown the winner a direction with my analysis. Don't forget to comment and subscribe. And yes, until next time.